They thought she was just another desperate job seeker, someone they could dismiss with a smirk and a condescending laugh. The executives at TechVantage Solutions had seen hundreds of candidates walk through their glass doors, but when Sarah Mitchell entered that conference room, they saw what they wanted to see: an easy target. Her quiet demeanor and modest appearance made them believe she was weak, unremarkable, just another resume in a stack of forgettable applications. They had no idea that the woman sitting across from them had carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire, had made split-second decisions that saved lives, and wore the highest honor her country could bestow. When Derek Thompson started his cruel game of humiliation, he thought he was breaking down just another applicant. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't just anyone, and when the truth finally surfaced, it would shatter every assumption in that room and leave careers hanging in the balance. This is a story about respect, hidden valor, and the moment when true character reveals itself in the most unexpected ways. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floors of Meridian Tower as Sarah Mitchell stepped through the revolving doors into the bustling lobby of downtown Phoenix's most prestigious business district. The building stretched 30 stories into the clear Arizona sky, its glass facade reflecting the desert mountains in the distance. Sarah paused for a moment, adjusting the strap of her simple black portfolio bag and smoothing down her navy blazer. The outfit was professional but unremarkable, purchased from a discount store with the last of her savings. She had chosen it specifically to blend in, to avoid drawing attention to herself in a world where she still felt like an outsider. The lobby buzzed with the energy of corporate success. Men in $1,000 suits strode purposefully toward elevator banks, while women in designer heels clicked across the marble, their conversations filled with industry jargon and million-dollar deals. Sarah observed it all with the same quiet attention she had once used to scan hostile terrain, noting exits, reading body language, assessing potential threats. Old habits died hard, even in civilian settings. TechVantage Solutions occupied floors 15 through 20 of the tower, and Sarah had spent weeks researching the company before applying for the operations manager position. Founded 12 years ago by a group of MIT graduates, the firm had built its reputation on innovative technology consulting for Fortune 500 companies. Their client list read like a who's who of American business, and their revenue had grown exponentially year over year. It was exactly the kind of stable, respectable company where Sarah hoped to build her new civilian career. The elevator ride to the 15th floor gave Sarah a moment to center herself. She closed her eyes briefly, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. This interview represented more than just a job opportunity. It was her chance to prove that her military service had prepared her for success in the corporate world. More importantly, it was her path to financial stability for herself and her elderly mother, whose medical bills had been mounting since her diagnosis with early-stage dementia. When the elevator doors opened, Sarah was greeted by a reception area that screamed expensive modern design. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the Phoenix skyline, while contemporary art pieces adorned the walls between gleaming company awards and industry recognitions. The reception desk curved in an elegant arc of white marble and brushed steel, behind which sat a young Latina woman with kind eyes and a genuine smile. "You must be Sarah Mitchell," the receptionist said warmly, rising from her chair with an outstretched hand. "I'm Maria Rodriguez. Welcome to TechVantage Solutions." Sarah shook Maria's hand, appreciating the firm grip and direct eye contact. In her military experience, you could tell a lot about people from their handshakes, and Maria spoke of confidence and sincerity. "Thank you," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the nervous energy she felt building in her chest. "I'm here for the 10 o'clock interview with the operations team." Maria's smile widened as she gestured toward a seating area furnished with sleek leather chairs and a glass coffee table displaying the latest issues of Forbes and Harvard Business Review. "Perfect timing. The team is just finishing up their morning meeting. Can I get you some coffee or water while you wait?" "Coffee would be great, thank you." Sarah said, settling into one of the chairs. The leather was soft and expensive, the kind of luxury she had rarely experienced during her years of military service. She reminded herself that she belonged here, that her leadership experience and problem-solving skills were exactly what any smart company would value. As Maria prepared the coffee, Sarah allowed herself to study the awards lining the reception area walls. TechVantage had been recognized for innovation, growth, and workplace excellence. One particular plaque caught her attention: Phoenix Business Journal's Best Places to Work, 2023. She felt a flicker of hope that perhaps this company truly valued its employees and would see past surface impressions to recognize real capability. "Here you go," Maria said, returning with a steaming mug of coffee and a heavy ceramic cup bearing the TechVantage logo. "The team should be ready for you in just a few minutes. Between you and me," she added in a conspiratorial whisper, "I've seen your resume. Very impressive background. I think you're going to do great." Sarah felt a genuine smile cross her face for the first time that morning. "I appreciate that, Maria. Really." As she sipped her coffee, Sarah found herself thinking about the path that had led her to this moment. 5 years ago, she had been Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell, serving her third deployment in Afghanistan as a combat medic with the 75th Ranger Regiment. The military had been her life since she was 18, providing structure, purpose, and a clear mission that made sense of an otherwise chaotic world. She had loved the work, despite its dangers and hardships. There was something pure about the military mission: protect your fellow soldiers, complete the objective, bring everyone home. But even the best soldiers eventually had to transition to civilian life, and Sarah had always known that day would come. What she hadn't anticipated was how difficult that transition would prove to be. The corporate world operated by different rules, valued different skills, and often seemed to view military experience as an interesting footnote rather than valuable preparation for business leadership. Too many interviews had ended with polite rejections and vague suggestions that she might be better suited for security work or other roles that civilians seemed to think were more appropriate for former soldiers. This interview felt different, though. The operations manager position at TechVantage was exactly the kind of role where her military background should be an asset rather than a curiosity. Operations required strategic thinking, attention to detail, the ability to coordinate complex processes, and above all, leadership under pressure. Sarah had spent years mastering exactly those skills in environments where failure meant lives lost rather than profits missed. "Sarah Mitchell?" A new voice interrupted her thoughts, and she looked up to see a tall, professionally dressed woman approaching with a tablet in her hand. "I'm Linda Foster from Human Resources. The team is ready for you now." Sarah stood, straightening her blazer and picking up her portfolio. "Thank you, Linda. I'm ready." Linda led her down a hallway lined with glass-walled conference rooms and open-concept workspaces, where employees sat at standing desks equipped with multiple monitors. The atmosphere was energetic, but focused, with the quiet hum of productivity that Sarah recognized from well-functioning military units. People seemed engaged with their work, collaborating easily, and maintaining the kind of professional demeanor that suggested good leadership and clear expectations. "Conference room B is just ahead," Linda said as they walked. "You'll be meeting with Derek Thompson, our HR director, Brad Stevens from marketing, and Jessica Parker from finance. They're the core team you'd be working with most closely in the operations manager role." Sarah nodded, mentally preparing herself for the standard interview questions about her background, her goals, and her relevant experience. She had rehearsed her responses carefully, focusing on how her military leadership translated to business management, her experience with logistics and coordination, and her commitment to excellence in everything she undertook. Conference Room B was an impressive space with floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the desert landscape beyond Phoenix's urban sprawl. A polished granite table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. 3 people were already seated at the table, engaged in animated conversation that stopped abruptly when Linda knocked on the glass door. "Team, I'd like you to meet Sarah Mitchell." Linda announced as she opened the door and gestured for Sarah to enter. The first thing Sarah noticed was the shift in atmosphere as she stepped into the room. The easy camaraderie she had observed moments before seemed to evaporate, replaced by a cooler, more appraising energy. The three interviewers looked up with expressions that struck Sarah as more skeptical than welcoming, their eyes taking in her appearance with the kind of quick, dismissive assessment she had learned to recognize and ignore. Derek Thompson rose from his seat at the head of the table, extending a hand with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was exactly what Sarah had expected from his LinkedIn profile, mid-40s, expensively dressed, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested he was accustomed to being the most important person in any room. His handshake was firm but brief, the gesture of someone going through the motions of politeness rather than expressing genuine interest. "Sarah, welcome to TechVantage," Derek said, his tone professional but notably lacking the warmth Maria had shown. "Please, have a seat. I'm Derek Thompson, HR Director, and these are my colleagues, Brad Stevens and Jessica Parker." Brad Stevens was younger, probably early 30s, with the kind of carefully styled appearance that suggested significant investment in personal grooming. His suit was clearly expensive, and his handshake came with the overly firm grip of someone trying to establish dominance. Jessica Parker offered a more reserved greeting, her expression neutral but her body language suggesting she was already forming judgments about Sarah's suitability for the role. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me," Sarah said as she settled into the chair across from them, placing her portfolio on the table with the same precise movement she had once used to position equipment in the field. "I'm excited to learn more about the operations manager position and discuss how my background might contribute to TechVantage's continued success." Derek leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting to something that might have been amusement if it hadn't carried such a condescending edge. "Yes, let's talk about your background. I have to say, when I first saw your resume, I was surprised. It's not often we see applications from, well, people with your particular type of experience." Sarah felt a familiar tension beginning to build in her shoulders, the same alertness that had once warned her of incoming danger. Derek's tone carried implications that went beyond simple curiosity about her military service, but she maintained her composed expression and waited for him to continue. "I mean, obviously we respect military service," Derek went on, glancing at Brad and Jessica as if seeking their agreement. "But this is a corporate environment, Sarah. We're talking about managing complex technology projects, coordinating with sophisticated clients, maintaining relationships with industry leaders. It's quite different from, military operations." Brad Stevens leaned forward with a grin that Sarah immediately disliked. "Yeah, I have to admit, when Derek first showed me your resume, my first thought was whether you'd be comfortable in a business suit instead of, well, fatigues." He chuckled at his own comment, and Jessica's lips curved in what might have been a smile. Sarah felt the familiar calm descending over her, the same emotional control that had served her well in countless high-stress situations. She had faced this kind of condescension before, the assumption that military service somehow made her less qualified for civilian work rather than uniquely prepared for it. "I understand your concern," she replied evenly, "but I think you'll find that military leadership translates very well to business management. In fact, many of the skills required for the operations manager position, coordination of complex processes, leadership under pressure, strategic planning, are exactly what I developed during my time in service." Derek's eyebrows rose slightly, as if her articulate response had surprised him. "That's an interesting perspective. But tell me, Sarah, what makes you think you can handle the sophisticated demands of our client base? We're talking about Fortune 500 executives, people who expect a certain level of preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story of polish. No offense, but military culture isn't exactly known for its subtlety. The comment hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. Derek wasn't just questioning her qualifications. He was deliberately trying to undermine her confidence, to make her feel small and out of place. It was a tactic she had seen bullies use countless times, both in the military and in civilian life. The goal was to establish dominance through humiliation, to make the target doubt their own worth. But Derek Thompson had badly miscalculated his target. Sarah Mitchell had faced down enemy fire, had made life-or-death decisions while under attack, had carried wounded soldiers to safety while bullets whistled overhead. A corporate bully in an expensive suit was hardly the most intimidating opponent she had ever faced. "I appreciate your directness, Derek," Sarah replied, her voice remaining perfectly steady. "You're right that military culture values directness over polish. We tend to focus on results rather than presentation. For example, when I was responsible for coordinating medical evacuations under combat conditions, our clients, the wounded soldiers, didn't care about subtlety. They cared about competence, reliability, and the ability to perform under pressure. I think you'll find those same qualities are valued by any client who wants their projects completed successfully." Linda Foster, who had remained quiet during the exchange, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Sarah caught the movement in her peripheral vision and recognized the body language of someone witnessing behavior they found inappropriate but felt powerless to address. Brad Stevens jumped back into the conversation with the enthusiasm of someone who enjoyed verbal sparring. "But come on, Sarah, you have to admit there's a big difference between military operations and business management. In the military, you just follow orders, right? Here at TechVantage, we need people who can think creatively, who can adapt to changing situations, who can handle ambiguity. It's not exactly a command and control environment." Sarah almost smiled at the profound ignorance of Brad's statement. Anyone who thought military operations were simply about following orders had never spent a day in actual combat, where split-second decisions and creative problem-solving were the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But she kept her expression neutral and her voice professional. "I think you might have some misconceptions about modern military operations, Brad. In reality, junior leaders in the military are given significant autonomy and expected to adapt to rapidly changing situations with minimal guidance. For instance, as a combat medic, I frequently had to make independent decisions about resource allocation, evacuation priorities, and treatment protocols under extremely fluid conditions. The military actually prizes adaptability and creative problem-solving, particularly in combat environments where standard procedures often don't apply." Jessica Parker spoke for the first time since the introductions, her tone carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to analyzing financial data. "That's all very interesting, Sarah, but how do we know you can handle the interpersonal aspects of this role? Managing operations here means working with people who have advanced degrees from top universities, people who are accustomed to a certain level of intellectual discourse. Will you be able to relate to colleagues who might have very different backgrounds from your own?" The question was phrased professionally, but Sarah heard the underlying message clearly. Jessica was questioning whether someone with Sarah's background could fit in with the educated elite, who presumably populated TechVantage's upper ranks. It was classism disguised as legitimate concern, and it struck Sarah as particularly ironic, given that her military service had brought her into contact with people from every conceivable background and education level. "I've had the privilege of working with incredibly diverse teams throughout my military career," Sarah responded, maintaining her composed tone despite the growing frustration she felt. "Soldiers come from every background imaginable, every education level, every economic class. Success in the military depends on your ability to bring out the best in everyone, regardless of their background, and to build cohesive teams from diverse groups of individuals. I think you'll find that experience translates very well to the corporate environment." Derek leaned forward, his expression sharpening with what looked like predatory interest. "But Sarah, let's be honest here. You're asking us to take a pretty significant risk. We have established processes, proven systems, relationships that have taken years to build. How do we know you won't come in here and try to run this place like a military unit? How do we know you understand the difference between corporate leadership and military command?" Sarah felt a flash of anger at the continued implications that her military service was somehow a liability rather than an asset. but she channeled that emotion into an even more controlled response. "Derek, I think you're operating under some significant misunderstandings about military leadership. Modern military officers are trained in servant leadership, consensus building, and collaborative decision-making. The stereotype of the screaming drill sergeant might make for good movies, but it bears no resemblance to actual military leadership in operational environments. If anything, military leaders learn to achieve results through influence and inspiration rather than authority, because, in combat situations, people follow leaders they trust and respect, not those who simply outrank them." The room fell silent for a moment, and Sarah could see that her responses were not having the effect Derek had intended. Instead of becoming flustered or defensive, she was calmly dismantling their preconceptions while demonstrating exactly the kind of composure and intelligence that should have impressed any reasonable interviewer. But Derek Thompson was not being reasonable, and Sarah was beginning to understand that this interview was not about assessing her qualifications. It was about something else entirely, something that had less to do with her capabilities and more to do with how she fit into their preconceived notions of who belonged in their corporate culture. Brad Stevens shifted in his expensive leather chair, his manicured fingers drumming against the polished granite table as he studied Sarah with the calculating gaze of someone preparing for what he clearly considered sport. The morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows caught the gold threads in his tie, a detail that probably cost more than Sarah's entire interview outfit. He exchanged a meaningful glance with Derek Thompson, and Sarah recognized the silent communication that passed between them. They had moved beyond legitimate interview questions into territory that felt distinctly predatory. "You know, Sarah," Brad began, his tone adopting the false friendliness that Sarah had learned to distrust, "I'm curious about something. When you were in the military, did you ever have to deal with, shall we say, challenging authority figures? I mean, we've all heard stories about military harassment, hazing, that sort of thing. How do we know you won't bring that kind of baggage into our workplace culture?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected, but because it revealed the depth of Brad's willingness to weaponize her service against her. He was essentially asking whether she had been a victim of military sexual harassment, disguising the invasive personal question as a legitimate concern about workplace behavior. It was the kind of loaded inquiry that had no good answer, designed to put her on the defensive regardless of how she responded. Sarah felt the familiar ice-cold calm settling over her thoughts, the same mental clarity that had served her in countless life-threatening situations. Her voice remained steady, professional, completely controlled. "I think you're conflating Hollywood stereotypes with reality, Brad. The military I served in has zero tolerance for harassment or unprofessional behavior. In fact, military standards for workplace conduct are often higher than those in civilian corporations. We're trained to treat every person with dignity and respect, regardless of rank or position." Jessica Parker leaned forward, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the light as she adopted an expression of mock concern. "But surely you must understand our position, Sarah. We're trying to build a progressive, inclusive workplace here at TechVantage. We need to know that our employees can handle sophisticated interpersonal dynamics, that they understand modern workplace sensitivities. Military culture is so rigid. How do we know you can adapt to our more collaborative approach?" The irony of Jessica's statement was breathtaking. Here she was, participating in what was clearly a coordinated effort to humiliate and intimidate a job candidate, while simultaneously claiming to champion progressive workplace values. Sarah recognized the tactic from her military training in psychological operations. Accuse your target of the very behavior you're exhibiting, creating confusion and forcing them to defend against charges that have no basis in reality. "I'm interested in your definition of collaborative, Jessica," Sarah replied, her tone remaining perfectly, even despite the growing tension in the room. "In my experience, true collaboration requires mutual respect, open communication, and the ability to value diverse perspectives. It means creating an environment where every team member feels safe to contribute their best ideas, regardless of their background or experience." Derek Thompson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Sarah caught the micro-expression that suggested her composed responses were not having the effect he had intended. He had clearly expected her to become defensive, flustered, or angry. Instead, she was demonstrating exactly the kind of grace under pressure that any competent interviewer would recognize as a valuable leadership quality. "Let's talk about something more concrete," Derek said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "This position requires managing significant budgets, sometimes 8-figure projects. Have you ever handled that kind of financial responsibility? I mean, beyond whatever petty cash they give you for military supplies?" The casual dismissal of military logistics as petty cash revealed Derek's profound ignorance about the scale and complexity of military operations. Sarah had overseen medical supply chains worth millions of dollars, coordinated resources across multiple bases and countries, and managed budgets that would dwarf many corporate departments. But she recognized that Derek wasn't asking for information. He was trying to establish her as fundamentally unqualified for the corporate world. "During my last assignment, I was responsible for managing medical supply procurement and distribution across 3 forward operating bases," Sarah responded calmly. "That included oversight of approximately $12 million in medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, and emergency supplies annually. The logistics coordination required managing multiple vendors, maintaining compliance with federal regulations, and ensuring zero-defect performance standards. When soldiers' lives depend on your supply chain management, the margin for error is considerably smaller than most corporate environments." Linda Foster, who had remained largely silent during the increasingly hostile exchange, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Sarah could see the younger woman struggling with what she was witnessing, clearly recognizing that the interview had veered far from professional standards but uncertain how to intervene without jeopardizing her own position. It was a dynamic Sarah had observed countless times in toxic organizations, good people staying silent because they feared the consequences of speaking up. Brad Stevens seemed to sense that their approach wasn't achieving the desired effect, so he decided to escalate further. "Okay, but let's get real here. You're sitting in one of the most competitive business environments in the country. Our clients expect sophistication, cultural awareness, the ability to navigate complex social dynamics. They're not going to be impressed by war stories or military jargon. How do you plan to connect with executives who went to Harvard Business School, who speak the language of high-level corporate strategy?" The question revealed Brad's fundamental misunderstanding of both military experience and effective business communication. Sarah had briefed generals, coordinated with State Department officials, and worked alongside some of the most intelligent and educated people in government service. The idea that military experience somehow disqualified her from communicating with business executives was absurd, but she recognized that Brad was more interested in establishing hierarchy than assessing capability. "I found that effective communication transcends background or education level," Sarah replied. "Whether you're briefing a general or explaining procedures to a new recruit, the principles remain the same. Be clear, be concise, focus on what matters most to your audience. In my experience, executives appreciate directness and competence more than impressive vocabulary or insider jargon. They want to know that you understand their challenges and can deliver results." Derek leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting to something that might have been amusement if it hadn't carried such a cold edge. "You know, Sarah, I have to admire your confidence, but let me ask you this. What makes you think you're ready for this level of responsibility? I mean, you've been following orders your entire adult life. How do we know you can handle the autonomy and independence that this role requires?" The question demonstrated such a fundamental misunderstanding of military leadership that Sarah almost felt sorry for Derek's ignorance. Junior military leaders were routinely given enormous responsibility and expected to exercise independent judgment in situations where communication with higher command was impossible. Combat medics, in particular, were trained to make life-or-death decisions with minimal supervision, often under conditions of extreme stress and uncertainty. "I think you have a misconception about military leadership structure," Sarah said, her voice maintaining its professional tone despite her growing frustration. "In reality, military leaders at every level are expected to exercise initiative and independent judgment. Combat situations rarely unfold according to plan, so success depends on leaders who can adapt quickly, make sound decisions with incomplete information, and take responsibility for outcomes. If anything, military experience teaches you to handle autonomy and responsibility more effectively than most civilian environments." Jessica Parker glanced at her expensive watch, a gesture that seemed calculated to convey impatience with the entire process. "Look, Sarah, I'm sure you're a perfectly nice person, and we certainly appreciate your service to the country. But let's be practical here. This is a fast-paced, high-pressure environment. We need someone who can hit the ground running, who already understands corporate culture, who can integrate seamlessly with our existing team dynamics. Wouldn't you be happier in a role that's more suited to your background? Maybe something in security or government contracting?" The suggestion was delivered with a condescending smile that made Sarah's skin crawl. Jessica was essentially arguing that Sarah should accept a lesser role because her military background made her unsuitable for corporate leadership. It was the kind of casual discrimination that women veterans faced constantly, the assumption that their service experience was valuable only in roles that others considered appropriate for their background. "I appreciate your concern for my happiness, Jessica," Sarah replied, her tone remaining perfectly controlled. "But I applied for the operations manager position because my background has prepared me specifically for this type of role. Military experience in logistics, personnel management, and strategic planning translates directly to corporate operations. The question isn't whether I can adapt to your culture. It's whether your culture is ready to benefit from the unique perspective and proven capabilities that military leaders bring to civilian organizations." The silence that followed Sarah's response was charged with tension. She had effectively turned the tables, suggesting that TechVantage's ability to recognize and utilize her qualifications said more about their limitations than hers. It was a bold move, but Sarah was tired of playing defense against people who seemed determined to find her lacking, regardless of her actual qualifications. Derek's expression darkened, and Sarah could see that her refusal to be intimidated was beginning to genuinely anger him. He was accustomed to controlling interviews, to making candidates squirm and beg for his approval. Sarah's composed confidence was disrupting his usual power dynamic, and he clearly didn't appreciate the loss of control. "You know what, Sarah?" Derek said, his voice taking on a distinctly hostile tone. "I think we need to address the elephant in the room here. You're asking us to take a huge risk on someone who has no corporate experience, no business education, no track record in our industry. What you have is military service, and while that might be admirable, it doesn't necessarily qualify you for executive-level responsibility in a sophisticated business environment." Brad Stevens nodded enthusiastically, clearly enjoying what he perceived as Derek's decisive move to put Sarah in her place. "Exactly. I mean, no offense, but there's a reason why most successful executives have MBAs from top schools. There's a reason why corporate recruiters focus on candidates with proven business experience. Military service is great, but it's not a substitute for actual business qualifications." Sarah felt something shift inside her, a subtle but significant change in her emotional state. She had endured their condescension, their ignorance, and their casual prejudice with professional grace, but their latest comments crossed a line. They weren't just questioning her qualifications anymore. They were dismissing the value of military service itself, suggesting that the skills she had developed while serving her country were somehow inferior to the credentials they valued. "I find it interesting," Sarah said, her voice still calm but carrying a new undertone of steel, "that you equate business education with actual leadership capability. Tell me, Derek, how many MBAs have led teams under life-or-death pressure? How many top business school graduates have made decisions where failure meant people didn't come home to their families?" Derek's face flushed slightly, and Sarah could see that her question had struck a nerve. He was probably proud of his Ivy League credentials, accustomed to using his educational background as a weapon against people he considered inferior. Being challenged on the actual value of that education clearly made him uncomfortable. "That's not the point," Derek replied, his tone becoming more aggressive. "This is business, not war. We need people who understand profit margins, market dynamics, competitive strategy. We need people who can speak the language of corporate success." Sarah leaned forward slightly, her green eyes locking onto Derek's with an intensity that seemed to make him shift uncomfortably in his seat. "You want to talk about competitive strategy? I've operated in environments where your competitors are literally trying to kill you. You want to discuss resource management under pressure? I've allocated life-saving medical supplies while under enemy fire. You want someone who understands the stakes of failure? I've made decisions where the wrong choice meant soldiers died." The room fell completely silent. Even Brad Stevens, who had been eagerly participating in the verbal assault, seemed taken aback by the quiet intensity in Sarah's voice. Linda Foster was staring at her hands, clearly distressed by the direction the interview had taken. Jessica Parker's expression had shifted from condescending amusement to something that might have been uncertainty. Derek recovered first, his face settling into an expression of cold dismissal. "Look, Sarah, I think we've heard enough. Obviously, you're passionate about your military experience, and that's commendable. But passion isn't qualification. This position requires someone who can integrate with our corporate culture, someone who understands the sophisticated dynamics of modern business. I'm just not sure you're the right fit for what we're looking for." Sarah recognized the dismissal for what it was, Derek's attempt to end the interview on his terms, to assert his authority and send her away with her tail between her legs. But she wasn't ready to give him that satisfaction. She had endured 30 minutes of professional harassment disguised as legitimate questioning, and she wasn't about to slink away quietly. "Before you make any final decisions," Sarah said, her voice carrying a new quality that seemed to command attention, "I think there's something you should understand about the qualifications I bring to this position. You've spent the last half hour questioning whether my military background has prepared me for corporate responsibility. You've suggested that my service experience is somehow inadequate for the sophisticated demands of your business environment." She paused, letting her words sink in, watching as the three interviewers exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to sense that something significant was about to happen. "What you don't know," Sarah continued, her voice steady but carrying an unmistakable authority, "is that my military service included receiving recognition for actions that your Harvard MBAs and business school graduates will never match. You want to discuss leadership under pressure? You want to talk about making decisions that matter?" Derek opened his mouth to interrupt, but something in Sarah's demeanor stopped him. There was a quality to her presence now that hadn't been there before, a sense of quiet power that filled the room and demanded attention. "I earned the Medal of Honor," Sarah said simply, the words dropping into the silence like stones into still water. "For actions in Afghanistan that saved 12 soldiers' lives while under sustained enemy fire. So when you question my qualifications for corporate leadership, when you suggest that my military experience is somehow inadequate for your business environment, I want you to consider what that says about your ability to recognize actual leadership when it's sitting right in front of you." The effect of her words was immediate and profound. Derek's face went completely white, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Brad Stevens looked as if he had been physically struck, his cocky demeanor evaporating in an instant. Jessica Parker's perfectly composed expression cracked, revealing something that might have been shock or perhaps fear. Even Linda Foster looked up from her hands, her eyes wide with amazement and something that looked like vindication. Sarah let the silence stretch for a long moment, watching as the three interviewers struggled to process what they had just learned. The Medal of Honor was the highest decoration for valor that the United States could bestow, awarded only for acts of extraordinary heroism in combat. Fewer than 3,500 people had received the honor since it was created, and Sarah Mitchell was one of them. "Now," Sarah said, her voice returning to its earlier professional tone but retaining the new authority that came with revealed truth. "Would you like to continue this interview with a more appropriate level of respect? Or would you prefer that I share my experience of TechVantage's interview process with the business community in Phoenix?" The threat was delivered calmly, almost casually, but its implications were crystal clear. Sarah had just revealed that she was not just any veteran, she was a genuine American hero, and the way TechVantage had treated her during this interview would not reflect well on the company if it became public knowledge. In an era of social media and corporate accountability, the story of how they had mocked and dismissed a Medal of Honor recipient would spread quickly and damage their reputation irreparably. Derek Thompson's career flashed before his eyes as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. He had spent the last 30 minutes humiliating someone whose courage and leadership had been recognized at the highest levels of government. The story would be devastating. Tech company mocks war hero during job interview. It would be picked up by veterans organizations, social media, and probably national news outlets. His job, his reputation, his entire professional future could be destroyed by his own arrogance and prejudice. But before anyone in the room could respond to Sarah's revelation, the conference room door opened, and a new figure entered the space, completely unaware of the drama that had just unfolded. Robert Chen stepped into Conference Room B with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to command, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere in the space. As CEO and founder of TechVantage Solutions, he carried himself with the quiet authority that came from building a successful company from the ground up, but there was also a warmth in his demeanor that set him apart from the typical corporate executive. His expensive suit was perfectly tailored, but he wore it with the casual ease of someone who valued substance over appearance. "Sorry to interrupt," Robert said, his keen eyes quickly scanning the room and taking in the tense body language of everyone present. "I was hoping to catch the end of the interview and perhaps meet our candidate personally." Derek Thompson nearly knocked over his water glass as he lurched to his feet, his face still pale from Sarah's revelation moments before. "Mr. Chen, we weren't expecting you. We were just, wrapping up the interview process with Ms. Mitchell." Robert's gaze moved to Sarah, who had risen respectfully when he entered, but maintained the composed bearing that had characterized her throughout the interview. There was something in her posture, a subtle quality that Robert recognized immediately from his own military family background. His father had been a Marine Corps officer, and Robert had grown up around career military personnel. He knew how to read the signs of serious military experience, and everything about Sarah Mitchell suggested someone with significant service background. "Ms. Mitchell," Robert said, extending his hand with a genuine smile. "I'm Robert Chen, CEO of TechVantage. I apologize for interrupting your interview, but I make it a point to meet personally with candidates for senior positions." Sarah shook his hand with a firm grip, her eyes meeting his directly. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Chen. I've been impressed with TechVantage's reputation in the industry and excited about the possibility of contributing to your continued success." Robert held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, sensing undercurrents in the room that suggested the interview had not proceeded normally. Derek's obvious nervousness, Brad's uncharacteristic silence, and Jessica's rigid posture all indicated that something significant had occurred before his arrival. "I hope the team has been giving you a thorough opportunity to discuss your qualifications," Robert said, his tone carefully neutral, but his eyes sharp as they moved between the interviewers. "What's your background, Ms. Mitchell? I'd love to hear more about your experience." Derek cleared his throat nervously, clearly desperate to control the narrative before Sarah could speak. "Ms. Mitchell has military experience, sir. We were just discussing how that translates to corporate operations." Robert's eyebrows rose slightly at Derek's awkward phrasing. The HR director's discomfort was becoming more obvious by the moment, and Robert's instincts, honed by years of reading people in high-stakes business negotiations, told him that there was much more to this story. "Military experience?" Robert's interest was clearly piqued. "That's excellent. My father served in the Marines, so I have tremendous respect for military service." "What branch, Ms. Mitchell?" Sarah felt a subtle shift in the room's energy with Robert's arrival. Unlike the three people who had been interviewing her, the CEO seemed genuinely interested in her background, rather than looking for reasons to dismiss it. "I served in the Army for 8 years, Mr. Chen. Most recently as a staff sergeant with the 75th Ranger Regiment, working as a combat medic." Robert's expression immediately changed, his casual interest transforming into something much more serious. Anyone familiar with military structure knew that the 75th Ranger Regiment represented the elite of Army Special Operations, and combat medics within that unit were among the most highly trained and respected soldiers in the military. "Rangers," Robert said quietly, his voice carrying a new note of respect. "That's incredibly impressive. The training standards for Ranger medics are extraordinary. You must have seen significant combat experience." 3 deployments to Afghanistan, Sarah confirmed, her voice steady, despite the growing tension she could feel radiating from Derek and his colleagues. "I was responsible for medical operations across multiple forward operating bases." Brad Stevens, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since Sarah's earlier revelation, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Robert caught the movement and turned his attention to the marketing manager, his expression questioning. "I hope you've been appropriately recognizing the caliber of experience Ms. Mitchell brings to this interview," Robert said, his tone still friendly, but carrying an edge that suggested he expected a specific answer. Brad glanced nervously at Derek before responding. "Of course, sir. We've been having a very thorough discussion about how military experience translates to corporate environments." Robert's eyes narrowed slightly at the euphemistic phrasing. He had built TechVantage by developing an almost supernatural ability to read between the lines, and every instinct he possessed was telling him that this interview had not gone as it should have. "I'm curious about the specifics of that discussion," Robert said, settling into an empty chair at the table with the clear intention of staying for a while. "What aspects of Ms. Mitchell's military background have you been exploring?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah could see Derek's mind racing as he tried to figure out how to explain their behavior without revealing the extent of their inappropriate questioning. Jessica Parker looked as if she wanted to disappear into her chair, while Linda Foster seemed torn between relief that the CEO had arrived and terror about what might happen next. "Well," Derek began hesitantly, "we were discussing the differences between military and corporate culture, the transition challenges that veterans sometimes face, that sort of thing." Robert's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught a subtle tightening around his eyes that suggested he wasn't satisfied with Derek's vague explanation. "I see. And what conclusions did you reach about Ms. Mitchell's ability to handle those transition challenges?" The silence that followed was deafening. Derek, Brad, and Jessica all seemed paralyzed by the question, unable to admit what they had really been doing without exposing themselves to serious professional consequences. Sarah made a decision. Robert Chen seemed like someone who valued honesty and directness, and she was tired of watching the 3 interviewers squirm while pretending their behavior had been professional. "Mr. Chen," Sarah said, her voice calm but carrying the authority that had emerged earlier, "I think there may be some misunderstanding about how this interview proceeded. Your team expressed concerns about whether my military background had prepared me for corporate responsibility, whether I could relate to educated professionals, and whether my service experience constituted adequate qualification for executive-level work." Robert's expression darkened as Sarah spoke, his business instincts immediately recognizing the implications of what she was describing. Those weren't legitimate interview questions. They were the kind of discriminatory inquiries that could expose a company to serious legal liability. "I see," Robert said quietly, his voice taking on a coldness that made Derek visibly wince. "And how did you respond to those concerns?" Sarah glanced at the 3 interviewers, noting their obvious fear, before returning her attention to Robert. "I explained that military leadership, particularly at the special operations level, involves many of the same skills required for corporate management: strategic planning, resource allocation, personnel management, decision-making under pressure. I also mentioned that I had managed significant budgets and complex logistics operations during my service." Robert nodded slowly, his keen intelligence clearly processing not just what Sarah was saying, but what she wasn't saying. Her carefully professional language couldn't completely mask the inappropriateness of what had apparently taken place in this room. "That's certainly relevant experience," Robert said, his eyes moving to Derek with an expression that made the HR director shift uncomfortably. "I'm curious, though. Ms. Mitchell, was there anything specific about your military service that you think this team should know? Any particular achievements or recognitions that might be relevant to your qualifications for this position?" The question was asked innocently enough, but Sarah sensed that Robert Chen was the kind of leader who appreciated directness. His father's Marine background suggested he would understand the significance of what she was about to reveal. "Actually, yes," Sarah said, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had stunned the interviewers earlier. "I was awarded the Medal of Honor for actions during my final deployment. I led the medical evacuation of 12 wounded soldiers while under sustained enemy fire, coordinating with air support and ground units to extract casualties from an ambush site." Robert Chen went completely still, his eyes widening as the full impact of Sarah's words hit him. The Medal of Honor was not just another military decoration, it was the highest award for valor that America could bestow, reserved for acts of extraordinary heroism that went far beyond the call of duty. In his entire life, Robert had never met a Medal of Honor recipient, and the statistical rarity of the award made Sarah's presence in his conference room almost surreal. "The Medal of Honor," Robert repeated quietly, his voice filled with a reverence that was completely absent from the casual dismissiveness the other interviewers had shown. "Ms. Mitchell, that's extraordinary. There are fewer than 70 living recipients of that award." Derek Thompson felt the blood drain from his face as the full magnitude of his mistake became clear. He had spent the last hour mocking and dismissing someone whose courage had been recognized at the highest levels of American government. The implications for his career, for the company's reputation, for everything he had worked to build, were catastrophic. Robert's expression shifted as he processed not just Sarah's revelation, but the context in which she had revealed it. "Ms. Mitchell, can I ask what prompted you to share this information? Was it relevant to the discussion you were having with my team?" Sarah met his gaze steadily, recognizing that Robert Chen was giving her an opportunity to tell the full truth about what had transpired. "Your team expressed doubts about whether my military qualifications were adequate for corporate leadership responsibilities. They suggested that my lack of business education and corporate experience made me unsuitable for executive-level work. I felt it was important to provide complete context about the nature of my military service and the level of recognition it received." Robert's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he read between the lines of Sarah's diplomatic language. The picture emerging was of a Medal of Honor recipient being subjected to discriminatory questioning by his own staff, people who had apparently been too ignorant or prejudiced to recognize the extraordinary qualifications sitting in front of them. "I see," Robert said, his voice deadly quiet. "And how did the team respond when you provided that context?" Sarah glanced at Derek, whose face had taken on a grayish pallor that suggested he was beginning to understand the professional consequences of his behavior. The information seemed to surprise them. Robert turned his attention to Derek, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to something much more serious. "Derek, is Ms. Mitchell's characterization of this interview accurate? Did you and your team question whether her military service qualified her for corporate leadership?" Derek opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. He was trapped between admitting to discriminatory interview practices and contradicting a Medal of Honor recipient in front of his CEO. Either choice would likely end his career, but lying to Robert Chen would make the consequences even worse. "Sir," Derek finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper, "we were exploring how military experience translates to corporate environments. Standard interview procedure." Robert's eyes hardened at what was clearly an inadequate and misleading response. "Derek, let me be very clear about something. Standard interview procedure does not involve questioning whether military service constitutes adequate qualification for corporate work. Standard interview procedure does not involve expressing doubts about a candidate's ability to relate to educated professionals. And standard interview procedure absolutely does not involve dismissing the qualifications of a Medal of Honor recipient. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as Robert's words hit their target. Brad Stevens looked as if he might be sick, while Jessica Parker stared at her hands with the expression of someone contemplating the end of her career. Linda Foster, who had been uncomfortable throughout the interview, seemed torn between vindication and terror. "Ms. Mitchell," Robert said, turning back to Sarah with an expression that had returned to respectful professionalism, "I owe you a profound apology on behalf of TechVantage Solutions. The treatment you've received in this room is completely unacceptable and in no way reflects the values or standards of this company." Sarah nodded gracefully, her composure never wavering despite the dramatic shift in the room's dynamics. "I appreciate that, Mr. Chen. I understand that sometimes individual behavior doesn't represent organizational culture." Robert caught the subtle diplomacy in her response, the way she was giving him an opportunity to address the situation without completely destroying his employees. It was the kind of leadership grace that he recognized from the best executives he had worked with, and it only reinforced his growing certainty that TechVantage had nearly made a catastrophic mistake. "Tell me about the specific action that earned you the Medal of Honor," Robert said, his voice carrying genuine interest, rather than the skeptical interrogation his team had subjected her to. "If you're comfortable sharing those details." Sarah straightened slightly, her bearing shifting into something that was unmistakably military as she prepared to recount one of the most significant moments of her life. "It was during a routine patrol that turned into a complex ambush. Our convoy was hit with coordinated small arms fire and improvised explosive devices. We had multiple casualties, including several soldiers who were trapped in a disabled vehicle under direct enemy fire." Robert leaned forward, completely absorbed in her account. Derek, Brad, and Jessica remained frozen in their seats, trapped between their earlier dismissiveness and the growing realization of exactly who they had been interviewing. "The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly," Sarah continued, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of remembered intensity. "Air support was 20 minutes out, and the wounded soldiers couldn't wait that long. I coordinated with our team leader to establish a casualty collection point, then made multiple trips under fire to extract the wounded from the kill zone." Robert's respect for Sarah was growing with every word. The kind of courage required to repeatedly expose oneself to enemy fire for the sake of wounded comrades was almost incomprehensible to someone who had never faced combat. "The 12th soldier was critically wounded and trapped in the vehicle," Sarah went on. "The enemy had adjusted their fire to target our extraction route, so reaching him required crossing approximately 50 meters of open ground under sustained automatic weapons fire. I coordinated with our designated marksman to provide covering fire, then made the run." The conference room was completely silent as Sarah recounted her actions with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing a routine work procedure rather than an act of extraordinary heroism. Robert realized that this was probably how she approached all challenges, with calm analysis, strategic thinking, and absolute commitment to mission success. "I was able to stabilize his injuries and coordinate with the helicopter crew for extraction," Sarah concluded. "All 12 soldiers survived and eventually returned to duty." Robert sat back in his chair, struggling to process what he had just heard. The woman sitting across from him had single-handedly saved 12 lives while under enemy fire, demonstrating the kind of courage, leadership, and tactical brilliance that made her more qualified for executive responsibility than 99% of corporate candidates he had ever interviewed. "Ms. Mitchell," Robert said quietly, "that is one of the most remarkable accounts of leadership under pressure I have ever heard. The fact that you've been sitting in this room while my team questioned your qualifications it's unconscionable." Derek Thompson realized that his professional life was effectively over. There was no recovering from what had happened, no way to explain or justify the way he had treated a genuine American hero. The story would spread throughout the Phoenix business community, probably make national news and destroy not just his career but potentially damage TechVantage's reputation if not handled correctly. Mr. Chen, Derek said desperately, I think there may have been some miscommunication about the nature of our discussion. We were simply trying to thoroughly evaluate all aspects of Ms. Mitchell's background. Robert's expression turned glacial at Derek's attempt to reframe his behavior. Derek, I've been in business for 15 years, and I've conducted hundreds of interviews. What you've described is not thorough evaluation. It's discriminatory harassment. The fact that you subjected a Medal of Honor recipient to this treatment makes it even more inexcusable. Sarah watched the exchange with the detached interest of someone observing a tactical situation unfold according to predictable patterns. Robert Chen was clearly a competent leader who understood both the human and business implications of what had occurred. Derek Thompson, on the other hand, was revealing himself to be exactly the kind of insecure, prejudiced manager who created toxic workplace cultures. If I may, Sarah interjected, her voice cutting through the tension with calm authority, I think it might be helpful to focus on moving forward rather than relitigating what's already happened. Robert turned to her with an expression of amazement. Even after being subjected to an hour of inappropriate treatment, Sarah was demonstrating the kind of gracious leadership that sought solutions rather than revenge. It was exactly the quality he would want in any executive at his company. You're absolutely right, Ms. Mitchell. Let me be very direct about TechVantage's position. We would be honored to have someone of your caliber join our organization. The operations manager position is yours if you want it, and frankly, I think we should be discussing whether that role is senior enough to fully utilize your capabilities. The offer hung in the air like a thunderclap, stunning everyone in the room except Sarah, who received it with the same composed professionalism she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. Derek, Brad, and Jessica stared in shock, realizing that they had not only failed to eliminate an undesirable candidate, but had instead witnessed her being fast-tracked to a senior position. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Chen, Sarah replied. Before I respond, though, I think it would be helpful to understand how TechVantage plans to address the cultural issues that became apparent during today's interview. The way your team approached this discussion suggests some systemic problems that might affect other veterans or minority candidates. Robert's admiration for Sarah reached new heights, as he realized she was using her leverage not for personal gain but to improve conditions for future candidates who might face similar discrimination. It was the kind of leadership thinking that separated true executives from people who simply held executive titles. You're absolutely right, Robert said, his expression growing serious. What happened here today is unacceptable, and it requires immediate and comprehensive action. We'll be conducting a full review of our interview processes, implementing mandatory bias training for all staff involved in hiring, and establishing clear protocols to prevent this kind of discriminatory behavior. Derek's face had gone completely white as he realized that his actions had not only cost him his job, but were about to trigger a company-wide overhaul that would likely expose other problematic behaviors throughout the organization. Robert turned to address the three interviewers directly, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that changed people's lives. As for the immediate situation, I think it's clear that some personnel changes are necessary. Derek, we'll need to discuss your future with the company privately. The same goes for Brad and Jessica. The words were delivered calmly, professionally, but their meaning was crystal clear. All three interviewers understood that their careers at TechVantage were effectively over, ended by their own prejudice and poor judgment. Sarah observed the proceedings with the detached assessment of someone who had seen justice served in various forms throughout her military career. She felt no satisfaction in watching Derek's professional destruction, but she understood that accountability was necessary for organizational health. Mr. Chen, Sarah said, her voice drawing everyone's attention back to her. I'm interested in the position, but I'd like to understand more about the company culture and how TechVantage approaches diversity and inclusion beyond policy statements. It was a perfectly reasonable request, but coming from someone who had just exposed serious flaws in their hiring process, it carried additional weight. Robert recognized that Sarah was essentially conducting her own interview of TechVantage, evaluating whether the company met her standards rather than simply hoping to meet theirs. Robert Chen leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful as he considered Sarah's question about TechVantage's commitment to diversity and inclusion. The events of the morning had exposed serious flaws in his organization, but they had also presented an opportunity to demonstrate real leadership and meaningful change. He recognized that Sarah Mitchell wasn't just evaluating a job offer. She was assessing whether TechVantage deserved her service and whether the company could be trusted to honor the values she had risked her life to defend. That's an excellent question, Ms. Mitchell, and given what transpired here today, I understand why you'd want concrete answers rather than corporate platitudes, Robert began, his voice carrying the earnestness of someone who took the question seriously. Let me be completely transparent about where we are and where we need to go. He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the Phoenix skyline as he gathered his thoughts. The desert mountains in the distance reminded him of the landscapes his father had described from his Marine deployments, and the connection brought home the significance of the moment. TechVantage had the opportunity to not just hire an exceptional leader, but to demonstrate that corporate America could recognize and value military service appropriately. Honestly, today's interview process revealed that we have work to do, Robert continued, turning back to face the room. I built this company with the intention of creating an inclusive environment that valued diverse perspectives and backgrounds, but clearly our implementation has fallen short of our intentions. The fact that 3 senior staff members could conduct the kind of interview you experienced suggests systemic issues that go beyond individual bias. Derek Thompson sat rigidly in his chair, his career prospects crumbling around him as he listened to his CEO essentially catalog his failures. Brad Stevens and Jessica Parker seemed equally stunned by the swift reversal of their fortunes, their earlier confidence replaced by the growing realization that their behavior had exposed them as liabilities to the organization they had thought they were protecting. However, Robert said, his tone shifting to something more decisive, I see this as an opportunity to implement the kind of comprehensive changes that will ensure this never happens again. We'll be partnering with veterans organizations to develop proper protocols for evaluating military experience, implementing mandatory bias training for all hiring managers, and establishing oversight mechanisms to ensure our interview processes reflect our stated values. Sarah listened carefully, not just to Robert's words but to the conviction behind them. Her military experience had taught her to distinguish between leaders who made promises to escape immediate consequences and those who genuinely committed to meaningful change. Robert Chen's response suggested he fell into the latter category, but she needed to probe deeper to be certain. Those are important steps, Sarah acknowledged, but I'm curious about accountability. How will TechVantage ensure that the people responsible for implementing these changes are actually qualified to do so? And what mechanisms will prevent the kind of cultural attitudes that led to today's interview from simply going underground rather than being genuinely addressed? The question demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking that Robert valued in senior executives, but it also put him in the position of having to address the elephant in the room, the continued employment of the people who had created this situation. You're absolutely right to focus on accountability, Robert replied, his expression growing more serious. Effective change requires not just new policies, but leadership that can model and enforce appropriate behavior. That's why some personnel decisions are necessary. He turned to address Derek directly, his voice carrying the weight of executive authority. Derek, I think it's clear that your approach to candidate evaluation is fundamentally incompatible with TechVantage's values and our legal obligations. We'll need to discuss your departure from the company and ensure a smooth transition of your responsibilities. Derek's face crumpled as the final blow to his career was delivered with clinical precision. He had built his professional identity around his ability to control hiring processes and maintain what he saw as appropriate standards for the company. The irony that his own standards had proven to be inappropriate seemed lost on him as he struggled to process his dismissal. Mr. Chen, Derek said desperately, I think there's been a misunderstanding about my intentions. I was simply trying to ensure that candidates met our cultural requirements. Robert's expression hardened at Derek's continued attempt to justify his behavior. Derek, there was no misunderstanding. You subjected a Medal of Honor recipient to discriminatory questioning based on your personal biases about military service. That's not cultural screening. It's precisely the kind of prejudice that we need to eliminate from our organization. Brad Stevens and Jessica Parker exchanged panicked glances, realizing that if Derek was being terminated, their own positions were likely equally precarious. Brad cleared his throat nervously, attempting to salvage his situation through association with his soon-to-be former colleague. "Sir, I want to clarify that I was following Derek's lead in the interview process," Brad said, his voice strained with barely controlled panic. "I don't personally have any issues with military service. I was simply participating in what I thought was standard procedure." Robert turned his attention to Brad, with an expression that suggested he found the attempt to shift blame particularly distasteful. "Brad, you're a senior manager in this organization. You're expected to exercise independent judgment and uphold professional standards, regardless of what others around you might be doing. The fact that you participated in inappropriate questioning rather than intervening or objecting suggests a fundamental failure of leadership on your part." Sarah watched the proceedings with the clinical interest of someone observing a case study in organizational dynamics. The rapid collapse of the three interviewers' positions demonstrated how quickly institutional change could occur when leadership was willing to take decisive action. It also revealed the superficial nature of their earlier confidence. When faced with real consequences, their united front had dissolved into desperate individual attempts at self-preservation. "Jessica," Robert continued, turning to the finance director who had remained largely silent since his arrival, "your participation in this interview raises serious questions about your judgment and your commitment to our organizational values. We'll need to have a comprehensive discussion about your future role at TechVantage." Jessica's professional composure finally cracked, her carefully maintained facade giving way to visible distress. "Mr. Chen, I recognize that the interview didn't go as it should have. I'm committed to learning from this experience and ensuring it doesn't happen again." "I appreciate that sentiment," Robert replied, "but commitment to learning isn't sufficient when the behavior in question involves discrimination against a war hero. The damage to our reputation, our legal exposure, and our organizational culture requires more than promises of future improvement." Linda Foster, who had been largely silent throughout the ordeal, shifted uncomfortably in her seat as she realized that her presence during the inappropriate interview might implicate her as well. Robert seemed to sense her concern and addressed her directly. "Linda, your role in today's events was different from the others. As a junior staff member, you were in a difficult position when senior colleagues engaged in inappropriate behavior. However, going forward, all TechVantage employees will be expected to speak up when they witness discrimination or harassment, regardless of the seniority of the people involved." The distinction Robert drew between Linda's position and that of the three senior interviewers demonstrated his understanding of organizational power dynamics and his commitment to creating a culture where speaking truth to power was not only acceptable but expected. Sarah observed these interactions with growing respect for Robert's leadership approach. He was addressing the immediate personnel issues while simultaneously establishing new cultural expectations for the entire organization. It was exactly the kind of systematic thinking she would expect from an effective executive. "Mr. Chen," Sarah interjected, "I'd like to understand more about how these changes will be implemented and monitored." Organizational culture change requires sustained effort and consistent reinforcement, not just policy announcements. Robert smiled, recognizing that Sarah was essentially interviewing him for the quality of his leadership rather than simply evaluating a job offer. It was exactly the kind of thorough assessment he would expect from someone who had earned the Medal of Honor. "You're absolutely right," Robert acknowledged. "Effective culture change requires comprehensive implementation with clear metrics and ongoing accountability. We'll be establishing a diversity and inclusion council with rotating leadership, implementing quarterly reviews of hiring practices, and creating anonymous feedback mechanisms for employees to report concerns about discrimination or bias." He paused, then added with evident sincerity, "I'd also like to invite you to lead our veteran recruitment and integration initiative, assuming you decide to join TechVantage. Your experience and perspective would be invaluable in ensuring we properly recognize and utilize military talent." The offer represented more than just employment. It was an opportunity for Sarah to shape organizational culture and ensure that other veterans would not face the kind of treatment she had experienced. It was exactly the type of meaningful work that could provide purpose and fulfillment in her civilian career. "That's an intriguing possibility," Sarah replied thoughtfully. "I'd want to understand the scope of authority and resources available for such an initiative, as well as the company's commitment to implementing recommendations that might challenge existing practices." Robert's admiration for Sarah continued to grow as she demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that separated exceptional leaders from merely competent ones. She wasn't just accepting his offer, she was ensuring that any commitment she made would be backed by the authority and resources necessary for success. "The initiative would report directly to me," Robert said, "with full authority to review and recommend changes to hiring practices, orientation programs, and career development pathways for veteran employees. You'd have access to external consultants, partnership opportunities with veterans organizations, and a dedicated budget for program implementation." Derek Thompson sat in stunned silence as he listened to Robert essentially offer Sarah a senior leadership role that would give her significant influence over the very processes Derek had thought he controlled. The irony of his situation was profound. His attempt to exclude Sarah from the organization had instead resulted in her being positioned to transform it. "There's one more aspect of this situation that needs to be addressed," Robert continued, his expression growing more serious. "The way today's interview was conducted potentially exposed TechVantage to significant legal liability. We need to understand the full scope of what occurred and take appropriate remedial action." Sarah recognized that Robert was giving her an opportunity to pursue legal action against the company if she chose to do so. The discriminatory nature of the interview, combined with her status as a Medal of Honor recipient, would likely result in substantial damages and devastating publicity for TechVantage. "I appreciate your acknowledgement of the legal issues," Sarah said carefully, "but I'm more interested in seeing meaningful change than pursuing punitive measures. If TechVantage is genuinely committed to implementing the reforms you've outlined, I think that would be a more productive outcome than litigation." Robert felt a profound sense of relief at Sarah's response, not just because it protected his company from legal consequences, but because it demonstrated the kind of constructive leadership approach that could genuinely transform organizational culture. Sarah was choosing to use her leverage for positive change rather than personal gain or revenge. "I want to be very clear about our commitment," Robert said, his voice carrying the weight of a binding promise. "These changes will be implemented comprehensively and permanently, not just as a response to this specific incident. TechVantage will become a model for how corporate America should recognize and value military service." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the conference room door. Maria Rodriguez, the receptionist who had greeted Sarah that morning, appeared with a concerned expression. "Mr. Chen, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been some discussion in the office about the interview process today. Several employees have expressed concerns about what they've heard." Robert exchanged a meaningful glance with Sarah, recognizing that news of the inappropriate interview had already begun spreading through the organization. The situation required immediate and transparent communication to prevent rumors and speculation from damaging company morale. "Thank you, Maria," Robert said. "Please schedule an all-hands meeting for this afternoon. We'll be addressing the situation directly and announcing some important changes to our hiring and inclusion practices." As Maria left to arrange the meeting, Robert turned back to Sarah with an expression that combined respect, determination, and a hint of vulnerability. "Ms. Mitchell, I know this has been an extraordinarily difficult experience, but I hope you'll consider giving TechVantage the opportunity to prove that we can be better than what you experienced today." Sarah studied Robert's face, reading the sincerity in his expression and weighing the potential impact she could have on the organization. Her military service had been motivated by a desire to protect and serve something larger than herself, and she recognized that this opportunity could allow her to continue that mission in a different context. "Mr. Chen, I'm willing to accept the operations manager position and take on the veteran integration initiative, but with several conditions," Sarah said, her tone businesslike but not adversarial. "First, I want quarterly progress reports on diversity metrics and inclusion initiatives, with the understanding that insufficient progress would trigger my involvement in identifying necessary changes. Second, I want the authority to establish partnerships with veterans organizations without requiring approval from intermediate managers. Third, I want a commitment that the changes we implement will be sustained even if leadership changes in the future." Robert listened to Sarah's conditions with growing appreciation for her strategic thinking. She was essentially negotiating not just for herself, but for all future veteran candidates who might seek opportunities at TechVantage. "Those conditions are not only acceptable, they're exactly what I would expect from someone with your leadership background," Robert replied. "You have my commitment that these changes will be implemented comprehensively and maintained permanently." The formal conclusion of their negotiation marked a profound transformation in the dynamics of the conference room. Derek, Brad, and Jessica sat in stunned silence, their earlier positions of authority replaced by the growing realization that they had not only lost their jobs, but had witnessed the elevation of someone they had tried to exclude. "There's one final matter that needs to be addressed," Sarah said, her tone becoming more serious. "The treatment I received today is probably not unique. There are likely other veterans, women, minorities, and members of other underrepresented groups who have faced similar discrimination during TechVantage's interview processes. Part of our reform effort should include reaching out to those individuals and demonstrating that the company has genuinely changed." Robert nodded emphatically, recognizing the wisdom and moral necessity of Sarah's suggestion. "Absolutely. We'll be conducting a comprehensive review of our hiring practices over the past several years and reaching out to candidates who may have been treated inappropriately. Where possible, we'll offer second interviews under proper protocols." The scope of the changes Sarah was proposing went far beyond addressing her individual situation. She was advocating for systemic reform that would benefit countless future candidates. It was exactly the kind of leadership thinking that Robert wanted to see throughout his organization. As the meeting drew to a close, Sarah felt a sense of cautious optimism about her decision to join TechVantage. The morning's events had revealed serious problems within the organization, but they had also demonstrated that the company's senior leadership was willing to take decisive action when confronted with evidence of discrimination and bias. "I look forward to starting this new chapter," Sarah said, rising from her chair with the same composed bearing that had characterized her throughout the ordeal. "And I'm excited about the opportunity to help TechVantage become the kind of organization that truly values diverse talent and perspectives." Robert stood as well, extending his hand with a genuine smile that replaced the tension and conflict that had dominated the conference room for most of the morning. "Welcome to TechVantage, Sarah. I have a feeling your arrival is going to mark the beginning of some very positive changes." As Sarah shook Robert's hand, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this moment. What had begun as a routine job interview had evolved into an opportunity to create meaningful change and continue her service in a new context. The discrimination she had faced was unfortunate, but her response to it had opened doors to influence and impact that might not have existed otherwise. Derek Thompson gathered his materials with the defeated air of someone whose professional world had collapsed in the span of a few hours. His attempt to maintain what he saw as appropriate standards had instead revealed the bankruptcy of his judgment and the superficiality of his qualifications. As he prepared to leave the conference room for what would likely be the last time as a TechVantage employee, he couldn't help but recognize the irony that his efforts to exclude Sarah had instead resulted in her being positioned to transform the very culture he had thought he was protecting. Brad Stevens and Jessica Parker followed Derek's example, collecting their belongings while avoiding eye contact with Sarah or Robert. Their participation in the morning's events had exposed them as followers rather than leaders, people who would abandon their principles rather than risk confronting inappropriate behavior by their colleagues. Linda Foster remained behind as the others filed out, approaching Sarah with an expression of genuine remorse and admiration. "Ms. Mitchell, I want to apologize for not speaking up during the interview. What happened today was wrong, and I should have found a way to intervene." Sarah appreciated Linda's honesty, and recognized the difficult position junior employees faced when witnessing misconduct by senior staff. Thank you for saying that, Linda. Going forward, I hope TechVantage will create an environment where everyone feels empowered to speak up when they see something that isn't right. As the conference room finally emptied, leaving only Sarah and Robert, the CEO took a moment to reflect on the morning's events and their implications for his company's future. Sarah, I want you to know that what happened here today has been a wake-up call for me personally, Robert said, his voice carrying deep sincerity. I thought I had built an organization that valued diversity and inclusion, but clearly I hadn't created the systems and accountability measures necessary to ensure those values were consistently practiced. Sarah nodded, appreciating Robert's willingness to acknowledge the gap between intention and implementation that existed in many organizations. The important thing is that you're committed to closing that gap. Real change takes time and sustained effort, but it's absolutely achievable when leadership is genuinely committed. As they prepared to leave the conference room, Sarah felt a profound sense of purpose about the work ahead. Her military service had been motivated by a desire to protect and defend the values that made America worth fighting for, and her new role at TechVantage would allow her to continue that mission by ensuring that corporate America lived up to its obligations to treat all citizens with dignity and respect. The transformation of TechVantage Solutions would become a model for how organizations could recognize and correct discriminatory practices while creating genuine opportunities for underrepresented talent. Sarah's experience, from the inappropriate interview to her ultimate hiring and elevation to a leadership role, would demonstrate that even the most challenging situations could become catalysts for positive change when met with courage, persistence, and principled leadership. In the months that followed, TechVantage's commitment to reform would be tested and proven through concrete actions rather than empty promises. Sarah's Veteran Integration Initiative would become a nationally recognized program, attracting top military talent and serving as a blueprint for other companies seeking to properly value military experience. The comprehensive changes to hiring practices would eliminate discriminatory behavior while improving the quality of candidate evaluation across all demographics. The story of Sarah Mitchell's interview at TechVantage would spread throughout the Phoenix business community and beyond, serving as both a cautionary tale about the consequences of discrimination and an inspiring example of how individual courage could catalyze organizational transformation. For veterans transitioning to civilian careers, Sarah's experience would provide hope that their service would eventually be recognized and valued appropriately by employers who understood the true nature of military leadership and sacrifice. As Sarah walked out of the Meridian Tower that afternoon, no longer just a job candidate but a senior executive with the authority to create meaningful change, she carried with her the satisfaction of knowing that her service to country would continue in a new form, ensuring that other veterans would never have to endure the kind of treatment she had faced that morning. 6 months after that pivotal interview at TechVantage Solutions, Sarah Mitchell stood before a packed auditorium at the Phoenix Convention Center, addressing the annual Southwest Veterans Career Summit. The irony wasn't lost on her that the woman who had been dismissed as unqualified for corporate leadership was now the keynote speaker at the region's most prestigious veteran employment event. Behind her on the massive screen, the TechVantage logo shared space with logos from dozens of other companies that had committed to the veteran hiring initiative she had pioneered. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but the results spoke for themselves. TechVantage's veteran recruitment program had become a model for the entire technology industry, attracting top military talent from across the country and fundamentally changing how the company approached diversity and inclusion. What had started as damage control following a discriminatory interview had evolved into a comprehensive cultural revolution that touched every aspect of the organization. When I walked into that interview 6 months ago, Sarah began, her voice carrying easily to the back of the auditorium, I thought I was just another veteran trying to translate military experience into corporate success. I had no idea that morning would become a catalyst for the kind of systemic change we're celebrating today. In the front row, Robert Chen listened with evident pride as Sarah recounted the journey that had brought them to this moment. The CEO, who had once worried about legal liability and reputation damage, now found himself leading an industry transformation that had exceeded his most optimistic expectations. TechVantage's stock price had reached record highs, driven partly by the innovative thinking and operational excellence that military veterans brought to the organization. The challenge we faced wasn't unique to TechVantage, Sarah continued, her tone becoming more serious. Across corporate America, military veterans encounter hiring managers who view their service through outdated stereotypes rather than recognizing the leadership capabilities they've developed. The statistics are sobering. Veteran unemployment remains higher than the national average, not because veterans lack qualifications, but because civilian employers don't understand how to evaluate military experience. Tom Williams, the security guard, who had recognized Sarah's military bearing on that first morning, sat among the audience members, wearing his dress uniform and beaming with pride. He had become one of the first beneficiaries of TechVantage's expanded veteran hiring program, transitioning from security work to a project management role that utilized his logistics background from 20 years of Army service. But today, I want to talk about solutions rather than problems, Sarah said, her tone shifting to the inspirational cadence that had made her a sought-after speaker. The last 6 months have proven that when organizations commit to genuine change, the results benefit everyone. TechVantage didn't just hire more veterans. We discovered that military experience brings unique value that strengthens every aspect of our operations. The audience erupted in applause, a mix of veterans seeking employment, corporate recruiters learning best practices, and community leaders supporting the initiative. Sarah's success story had become a rallying point for the broader movement to properly recognize military service in civilian hiring. Maria Rodriguez, now promoted to TechVantage's Director of Veteran Affairs, watched from the wings with satisfaction. The receptionist who had shown Sarah kindness on that difficult morning had emerged as a key leader in implementing the company's cultural transformation. Her instinctive recognition of Sarah's quality had been validated by subsequent events, and her promotion represented the organization's commitment to recognizing and developing talent regardless of traditional hierarchies. Let me share some concrete results, Sarah continued, clicking to a slide that displayed impressive statistics. In the 6 months since implementing our veteran integration program, TechVantage has increased veteran hiring by 400%. More importantly, our veteran employees are being promoted at rates 25% higher than the company average, and customer satisfaction scores for projects led by veteran managers have increased by 15%. The numbers represented more than statistical success. They validated Sarah's fundamental argument that military experience translated directly to corporate excellence. Each promoted veteran, each successful project, each satisfied customer contributed to changing perceptions about the value of military service in civilian careers. Derek Thompson wasn't present to witness Sarah's triumph, but the consequences of his actions continued to reverberate through the Phoenix business community. His termination from TechVantage had become a cautionary tale about the career consequences of discriminatory behavior, and his subsequent struggles to find employment served as a reminder that professional misconduct carried lasting penalties. Other HR professionals had quietly distanced themselves from his approach, recognizing that the business environment no longer tolerated the kind of bias he had demonstrated. The changes we've implemented go far beyond hiring quotas or compliance requirements, Sarah explained, advancing to a slide that outlined TechVantage's comprehensive veteran integration framework. We've created mentorship programs that pair veteran employees with civilian colleagues, ensuring knowledge transfer in both directions. We've established leadership development tracks that recognize military experience as preparation for executive responsibility. Most importantly, we've changed our organizational culture to value the diverse perspectives that veterans bring to problem solving. Brad Stevens and Jessica Parker had also faced professional consequences for their participation in the discriminatory interview. Word of their behavior had spread through industry networks, making them virtually unemployable in Phoenix's tight-knit business community. Their falls from corporate grace served as stark reminders that professional success could be destroyed quickly by poor judgment and prejudicial attitudes. But this transformation isn't just about veterans, Sarah continued, her voice carrying the passion that had driven her reform efforts. Creating an inclusive culture that properly values military experience benefits all employees, When organizations learn to recognize diverse forms of excellence, they become better at identifying and developing talent from all backgrounds. Linda Foster, who had remained with TechVantage and thrived under the new cultural standards, nodded enthusiastically from her seat in the audience. The junior HR associate, who had been uncomfortable during Sarah's original interview, had become a vocal advocate for inclusive hiring practices, using her experience as a cautionary tale about the importance of speaking up against discrimination. The veteran integration model we've developed at TechVantage is being adopted by companies across the technology sector, Sarah announced, clicking to a slide that showed the growing network of participating organizations. We're not keeping our best practices proprietary. We're sharing them freely, because the goal isn't competitive advantage. The goal is systemic change that ensures every veteran receives fair consideration for their qualifications. Robert Chen felt a surge of pride as he watched Sarah command the stage with the same composed authority she had demonstrated during that difficult interview. His decision to not only hire her but to give her significant autonomy had proven to be one of the best leadership choices of his career. TechVantage's reputation as an inclusive employer had attracted top talent from all demographics, creating a virtuous cycle of excellence that had elevated the entire organization. I want to address the corporate executives in the audience directly, Sarah said, her tone becoming more challenging. You have an opportunity to do more than simply avoid discrimination lawsuits. You have the chance to access a talent pool that has been systematically undervalued by your competitors. Military veterans bring leadership experience, operational excellence, and performance under pressure that your organizations need to thrive in competitive markets. The challenge was delivered with the same directness that had characterized Sarah's responses during her interview, but now it carried the authority of proven results rather than unrecognized potential. Corporate recruiters in the audience leaned forward, recognizing that Sarah's message represented both moral imperative and business opportunity. Let me tell you about Captain Jennifer Walsh, Sarah continued, introducing a case study that had become central to her presentations. Jennifer served 3 tours as a helicopter pilot in Afghanistan, managing complex logistics operations under combat conditions. When she interviewed with traditional corporate recruiters, they focused on her lack of business experience. When she interviewed with companies using our veteran integration protocols, they recognized her operational excellence and strategic thinking capabilities. The slide changed to show Jennifer's promotion timeline at TechVantage, where she had advanced from project coordinator to department head in just 4 months. Her success story had become emblematic of what was possible when organizations properly evaluated military experience. Jennifer is now leading our largest client engagement, a $50 million technology implementation for a Fortune 100 company, Sarah announced. Her military training in precision, accountability, and mission-focused execution has made her our most successful project manager. The client has specifically requested her for future engagements because they recognize the value of her leadership approach. The audience applauded enthusiastically, understanding that Jennifer's story represented the kind of opportunity that was being missed by companies that failed to properly evaluate veteran candidates. Sarah's presentation was systematically dismantling the stereotypes and misconceptions that had led to her own initial mistreatment. But individual success stories, while inspiring, aren't sufficient, Sarah cautioned, her tone becoming more serious. We need institutional change that makes these outcomes normal rather than exceptional. That's why TechVantage has partnered with the Arizona Department of Veterans Services, the Phoenix Chamber of Commerce, and 15 other major employers to create the Southwest Military Talent Initiative. The initiative represented the kind of collaborative approach that Sarah had advocated from the beginning, recognizing that systemic problems required coordinated solutions rather than individual company efforts. By working together, participating organizations could share best practices, standardize evaluation protocols, and create a regional culture that properly valued military service. The results have exceeded our most optimistic projections, Sarah continued, clicking to a slide that displayed regional employment statistics. Veteran unemployment in the Phoenix metropolitan area has decreased by 35% in the last 6 months, while average starting salaries for veteran hires have increased by 18%. More importantly, retention rates for veteran employees have improved dramatically because they're being placed in roles that utilize their actual capabilities. Ian Thistledown, the weathered regular from the Riverside Diner, where Sarah's original story had unfolded, wasn't present at the convention center, but his influence on Sarah's development remained significant. The former deputy sheriff who had provided quiet support and practical advice had taught her that real change required patience, persistence, and strategic thinking. His lessons about staying calm under pressure had served her well during the transformation of TechVantage's culture. "I want to share something personal about this journey," Sarah said, her voice taking on a more reflective tone. 6 months ago, I sat in an interview where my qualifications were questioned, my background was dismissed, and my potential was ignored. That experience could have discouraged me from pursuing corporate leadership opportunities. Instead, it became the catalyst for changes that have benefited thousands of veterans across our region. The personal revelation resonated powerfully with the audience, many of whom had faced similar challenges in their own career transitions. Sarah's willingness to transform a negative experience into positive change demonstrated the kind of resilience and leadership that made military veterans valuable employees. The lesson isn't that discrimination and bias are acceptable because they can sometimes lead to positive outcomes, Sarah clarified, recognizing the potential for misinterpretation. The lesson is that when we respond to injustice with strategic action rather than passive acceptance, we can create changes that prevent others from facing similar challenges. Robert Chen stood and began applauding, prompting the entire audience to rise in a sustained ovation that acknowledged both Sarah's personal courage and her professional achievements. The CEO, who had inherited a crisis 6 months earlier, was now leading an industry transformation that had enhanced his company's reputation and financial performance. "Looking forward, our goals are ambitious but achievable," Sarah announced as the applause subsided. "We're working with state legislators to create tax incentives for companies that achieve specific veteran hiring and promotion targets. We're partnering with universities to develop certification programs that help civilian managers understand how to evaluate military experience. Most importantly, we're building a network of veteran professionals who can mentor other transitioning service members." The comprehensive approach reflected Sarah's understanding that sustainable change required multiple complementary initiatives rather than single-point solutions. Her military training and systems thinking had proven invaluable in designing reforms that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. "To the veterans in the audience," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had walked the difficult path from military to civilian success. Quote, "Your service has prepared you for corporate leadership in ways that traditional business education cannot match. Don't let anyone convince you that your qualifications are insufficient. Demand that employers evaluate your actual capabilities rather than their assumptions about military experience." The message was delivered with the same composed confidence that had characterized Sarah's responses during her difficult interview, but now it carried the weight of proven success rather than unrecognized potential. Veterans in the audience sat straighter, inspired by her example and emboldened by her achievements. "To the corporate recruiters and hiring managers," Sarah continued, turning her attention to the other key audience segment, "you have an opportunity to access leadership talent that your competitors are overlooking. Military veterans bring operational excellence, ethical standards, and performance under pressure that can transform your organizations. The question isn't whether veterans can succeed in corporate environments. It's whether your organizations are sophisticated enough to recognize and utilize their capabilities." The challenge was direct but constructive, reflecting Sarah's approach of combining high expectations with practical support. She wasn't asking for charity or special consideration. She was demanding recognition of actual qualifications and proven capabilities. "The transformation we've achieved at TechVantage demonstrates what's possible when organizations commit to genuine change rather than superficial compliance," Sarah concluded, her voice rising with conviction. "We've proven that inclusive hiring practices don't lower standards. They raise them by ensuring that talent is recognized regardless of background or traditional credentials." As Sarah stepped away from the podium to thunderous applause, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The discrimination she had faced during that interview had been painful and frustrating, but her response to it had created opportunities for impact that might not have existed otherwise. Her military service had taught her that adversity could be transformed into advantage through strategic thinking and persistent effort. The reception following her presentation buzzed with energy as corporate executives, veteran job seekers, and community leaders discussed implementation strategies for the initiatives Sarah had outlined. Business cards were exchanged, partnerships were proposed, and commitments were made that would extend the impact of her work far beyond the Phoenix metropolitan area. Robert Chen approached Sarah during the reception, his expression combining professional satisfaction with personal gratitude. "I've been thinking about that morning 6 months ago," he said, his voice carrying the weight of reflection. "What happened in that conference room was inexcusable, but your response to it has transformed not just our company, but our entire industry. I'm honored to work with someone who can turn injustice into opportunity." Sarah appreciated Robert's acknowledgement, but she remained focused on the work ahead rather than past achievements. "The real test will be sustaining these changes over time," she replied. "Cultural transformation requires constant vigilance and continuous reinforcement. We've made impressive progress, but the work is far from finished." Her response demonstrated the same strategic thinking that had characterized her military service and her corporate leadership. Sarah understood that initial success could breed complacency if not carefully managed, and she remained committed to the long-term effort required for permanent change. Jennifer Walsh, the helicopter pilot whose success story had featured prominently in Sarah's presentation, joined their conversation with evident enthusiasm. "Sarah, the veteran mentorship program you designed has been incredible. I've been paired with 3 transitioning service members, and watching them succeed in their new roles has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my career." The mentorship program represented one of Sarah's most innovative initiatives, recognizing that successful veteran integration required ongoing support rather than just initial placement. By pairing established veteran employees with newcomers, TechVantage had created a system that accelerated integration while building professional networks within the veteran community. "That's exactly what we hope to achieve," Sarah responded. "Military culture emphasizes looking out for your fellow service members, and we wanted to preserve that sense of mutual support in the corporate environment. When veterans succeed, they create pathways for others to follow." Tom Williams, the former security guard who had become a project manager, approached with a broad smile and a firm handshake. "Ms. Mitchell, I can't thank you enough for what you've done. 6 months ago, I was convinced that my 20 years of Army logistics experience only qualified me for security work. Now I'm managing supply chain operations for our biggest client." Tom's transformation embodied the broader changes that Sarah's initiatives had created. His success wasn't just personal. It demonstrated to other organizations that they might be underutilizing veteran talent in entry-level positions, when those same individuals could excel in leadership roles. "Your success speaks to your own capabilities, Tom," Sarah replied. "The program just created an opportunity for those capabilities to be recognized and utilized. That's what happens when organizations evaluate potential rather than just traditional credentials." Maria Rodriguez joined the group, carrying a tablet filled with metrics from TechVantage's veteran hiring initiatives. "Sarah, I wanted to share the latest numbers with you. We're not just meeting our veteran hiring targets. We're exceeding them by 40%. More importantly, our veteran employees are reporting higher job satisfaction scores than any other demographic group." The satisfaction scores reflected more than successful placement. They indicated that veteran employees felt valued and appropriately utilized in their roles. Sarah had insisted from the beginning that the goal wasn't just to hire veterans but to create an environment where they could thrive and advance based on their merits. "Those numbers validate everything we've worked to achieve," Sarah said, reviewing the data with evident satisfaction. "When people are placed in roles that match their capabilities and given opportunities to grow, they naturally excel. The military teaches you to maximize human potential, and that lesson applies directly to corporate talent management." As the reception continued, Sarah found herself surrounded by veterans seeking advice, corporate executives exploring partnership opportunities, and community leaders interested in replicating TechVantage's success in other sectors. The conversations reinforced her belief that the changes they had implemented could scale far beyond the technology industry. Linda Foster approached toward the end of the evening, carrying a folder filled with research on veteran hiring practices across different industries. "Sarah, I've been analyzing how our model could be adapted for healthcare, manufacturing, and financial services. The fundamental principles seem universally applicable, but each sector would need customized implementation strategies." Linda's initiative demonstrated how the cultural changes at TechVantage had empowered employees at all levels to contribute to the organization's mission. Her research would form the foundation for expanding the veteran integration model beyond the technology sector. "That's excellent work, Linda," Sarah responded, accepting the folder with genuine appreciation. "Cross-industry expansion has always been part of our long-term vision. Your research will be invaluable in developing sector-specific approaches that maintain our core principles while addressing unique industry challenges." As the evening wound down and attendees began departing, Sarah stood on the convention center balcony overlooking the Phoenix skyline. The city lights sparkled in the desert darkness, reminding her of the view from TechVantage's conference room, where her journey had begun 6 months earlier. The transformation seemed almost surreal, but the concrete results spoke for themselves. Robert Chen joined her on the balcony, both of them reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. "You know," Robert said quietly, "that interview was the worst thing that happened to our company in years, but hiring you was the best decision I've ever made as CEO." Sarah appreciated the sentiment, but she remained focused on the broader implications of their work. "The real measure of success won't be what we've accomplished individually, but whether we've created sustainable changes that will benefit veterans for generations to come. That's the mission that matters." Her response embodied the service-oriented mindset that had characterized her entire career. From her military service to her corporate leadership, Sarah's commitment extended beyond personal success to systemic change that would create opportunities for others who followed in her path. The veteran integration model developed at TechVantage would indeed scale beyond Phoenix, beyond the technology sector, and beyond individual company initiatives. Sarah's presentation at the Southwest Veterans Career Summit had catalyzed a regional movement that would eventually influence national hiring practices and federal employment policies. In the months that followed, Sarah's story would be featured in Harvard Business Review, cited in congressional testimony on veteran employment, and taught as a case study in business schools across the country. The discrimination she had faced during that interview would be remembered not as an unfortunate incident, but as the catalyst for transformative change that benefited countless veterans seeking civilian careers. The lesson of Sarah Mitchell's experience extended beyond veteran employment to fundamental questions about how organizations recognize and develop talent. Her success demonstrated that true leadership could emerge from unexpected sources when given appropriate opportunities, and that diversity wasn't just a moral imperative, but a competitive advantage for organizations wise enough to embrace it. As Sarah drove home through the quiet Phoenix streets that night, she carried with her the satisfaction of knowing that her service to country had continued in a new form, creating opportunities and removing barriers for those who had similarly dedicated their lives to something larger than themselves. The Medal of Honor she had earned in Afghanistan represented individual courage under fire. The changes she had implemented at TechVantage represented collective courage in the face of systemic challenges. The story that had begun with discrimination and dismissal had evolved into a model for organizational transformation and a testament to the power of principled leadership in creating positive change. Sarah's journey from rejected job candidate to industry leader demonstrated that adversity could indeed be transformed into opportunity when met with strategic thinking, persistent effort, and unwavering commitment to values larger than personal success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.